Okay, we good? You guys here? Sorry. Okay. So thanks for coming out. Thanks to Kevin and his team for putting this together. We tried to kind of give this some organization with some slides, but really what we want to do is kind of give you an overview of the work that we do. Maybe kind of talk about some of the existing work that we've got going on, and probably try to impress upon you kind of the importance of some of the stuff that we're looking into, but really barely scratching the surface of it, because it is a pretty complex topic. But just to kind of get us started, it was interesting and it was very timely. Several of my friends and colleagues were texting me that the new word in the Cambridge Dictionary today was parasocial. And so we're gonna, and it pitched it as an unhealthy word, which is kind of one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit about today. But just to kind of get a sense, raise your hand if you follow a celebrity of some sort. Okay. That's not shocking. It's kind of hard to get an actual estimate on the number, but most studies are looking, given the culture, given the access that we have through social media and things like that, at least 70% are following at least one celebrity, broadly defined. So I'm going to let Dr. Locker kind of get us started and give us a context. And
okay, so oops about that. So this clicker is getting ahead of me there. Okay, so starting with parasocial, let's define that in case you haven't heard the term. Parasocial, broadly defined initially, Horton 1956, the idea of a one-sided relationship in which somebody is quite vested, knows a lot about, or feels a connection to somebody, and perhaps in the case of a celebrity, this person has no idea who they are. The other person has no idea who they are. So when talking about celebrity worship, there's this parasocial component of it, not completely synonymous, but that is a big component of it. So the idea then of celebrity worship as, we look at it, and it's viewed and been studied for quite a number of years, is the idea that initially somebody becomes interested in a celebrity for entertainment reasons, social reasons, and so on. And in some cases, it progresses farther than that. Okay, so the entertainment level, what's called the entertainment social level, is fairly benign. It's enjoyable and so on. But if the person has a difficulty, say some difficulty with identity formation, sense of self, or other factors that we could mention, this person might start to rely on that celebrity connection a little too much and become increasingly absorbed and so on as a means of continually coping. Assuming the problem that they initially have has not worked out at some point. And eventually, if that connection, that absorption becomes strong enough, they start to exhibit potentially addiction-like problems. So this is the absorption addiction model. And it is considered continuum. So you don't just jump to the worst step, start at that lower, that lower level of maladaptivity, entertainment social, and then again, not everyone, but a small percentage increase to, potentially pretty bad levels of this. And this is a measure by McCutcheon and colleagues, the Celebrity Attitude Scale, or the CAS. Okay. So it is a 23-item measure with 3 subscales. And the first is what I was mentioning, the entertainment social. So I'm using that. Again, this is what some people might consider to be somewhat synonymous with fandom. Go to conventions, Star Trek fans, which I was a big one. I'm a big one. Things like that. Music fans, whatever, and you get involved, like to interact socially with others and so on, and talk about that sort of thing. Again, considered fairly benign, even though depending on the person's underlying motivation, in my opinion, could be the start of something not so good. But for some people, will progress to the intense personal, and this is more characterized by things such as a much stronger absorption in the individual. So characterized by items such as my favorite celebrity is my soulmate, something like that. I think I have intrusive thoughts, or I think about this individual even when I don't want to. So some things like that. And then a few people move on to what's called a borderline pathological level, to be characterized by responding to items such as, if I would pay several $1,000s for something like a used napkin that I know my celebrity had at one point. Or if my favorite celebrity asked me to help them commit a crime, I probably would. They strongly agree, on those sort of things. So considered the worst aspect. So this is the primary measure again. Now over 20 years now as a measure of, we consider maladaptive celebrity worship and absorption. Okay. So
Yeah, and this just to kind of set us up for the next slide. This is something that's been on the rise. So we've had pretty good fortune to work with Lynn McCutcheon, who was the designer of that scale, in several capacities over the last 10 years. And so one thing that we know from his research, and it's been a vast amount of research looking at this scale in relation to several different things, whether it be in politics, mental health. His most recent study has its relationship to global warming and things like that. Like he's done everything with it. But we know, looking across his studies, and he and a colleague, Mara, published a recent article in 2021 to document just how much on the rise it is. And so I pulled a few tables from his paper just to kind of show you. This is just correlation data from year across those three subscales. And so we know that as the year increases, so do the scores tend to increase across these levels of celebrity worship. But even more kind of telling is actually when you look at the early studies and the late studies in this, you got to go back, across these. So these were the 5 earliest studies. So the early 2000s to kind of the 2020, 2021 timeframe. And so these were the scores on each of those subscales early on to later. And so you can clearly see like these numbers are really kind of skyrocketing. And I think the context in which celebrity worship is kind of emerging in a lot of people has changed significantly in the last 20 years, especially with technology. But the important part of that is hopefully what we're going to point out on the next slide, is that celebrity worship is an extremely complex topic. But the interesting thing, and we're not going to go through all of these, but over the course of the last 20 something years, celebrity worship has been connected to a lot of different things. And just to kind of give you a sense, several studies and some from our lab have linked celebrity worship to a lot of like maladaptive psychological mental health types of things like depression, stress, anxiety, loneliness, those kinds of things. We know from several of the studies in our lab, and we brought in one of the studies at the end to talk to you about because we think it was interesting, but we know kind of connecting cognitive and social a little bit. Celebrity worshipers are also demonstrating a higher tendency to believe in conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, lots of things on that realm. And some of the work is actually indicative that they tend to not be the greatest of critical thinkers, and they tend to accept things at face value a lot of times, which probably plays into a lot of that. I'll let you handle the personality one.
So if we look at these things too, one of the things you could summarize the connection of celebrity worship with these variables is, on the whole, it's with negative psychological variables, very few positive that comes up in the review of the literature. A personality, for example. So the one that our lab has focused on considerably is narcissism, for example. Now with narcissism, depending on how familiar people are with it, there are actually 2 subtypes. There's a grandiose form of narcissism in which it has very elevated high self-esteem, outgoing, extroversion, and so on, engages in social situations and relationships fairly easily, even though the quality of those relationships may be questionable, but some along those lines. And then there's another subtype that receives probably in the public consciousness anyway, lesser attention. And that's the what's called a vulnerable narcissism. So it's still a self-focus. So the 2 types have a self-focus, a sense of entitlement, and so on. But the other's characterized by more anxiety, social difficulties, hostility, and so on. So we tend to be, maybe a little bit more withdrawn and as we'll mention later, connected, maybe find these parasocial relationships more appealing. But an earlier study, for example, found a connection between the grandiose type and celebrity worship. It was kind of interesting, given that if someone thinks they're the focus of attention, why would they be so interested in a celebrity? But there was that connection with the grandiose in about 2004. Later on, there was a study that actually compared the two subtypes and found that they did not replicate the grandiose connection, but did find a pretty good correlation with the vulnerable. And then since then, we've done 3 or 4 studies where we've replicated that pattern of the vulnerable narcissism connection. So, and one of the explanations of that is that, again, that given the kind of social anxiety and so on, and greater negative emotionality connected with that subtype, that the parasocial nature of celebrity worship is more appealing. You become more absorbed in an idealized person that's in a non-threatening situation. So again, just across the board, though, looking at these, the negative mental health, the cognitive, the personality, definitely, not a positive aspect, at least as that celebrity worship increases in severity.
So what we wanted to do, just to kind of give this a little bit of some structure. So that last slide, I held back on trying to draw all the lines of all the connections across all of those. But if I did, it would be really messy, because a lot of those are connected. Probably some of the effects that we see are going through other variables and things of that nature. But in our lab, what we've been trying to do, we've really honed in on the vulnerable narcissism in general. But we have 2 slides worth of studies that are currently ongoing, just to kind of give you a sense of the different ways that we're looking at it. But I think in the end, we're really only kind of scratching the surface of this, because historically, a lot of the celebrity worship studies have been heavy correlational. So Lynn McCutcheon designed the study and decided, I want to see how this correlates with this measure. And he put teams together from all over the world to do this. And so a lot of stuff has been largely correlational. Our hope is that we're going to start trying to drill down. But just to kind of give you a sense of some of the studies, we wanted to hit on a few of these. I'll let you kind of go through these first ones.
Yeah. So the measure of celebrity worship and parasocial commitment, there was a recent measure that of parasocial commitment to celebrity influencers, for example. And in fact, going back to the vulnerable narcissism, we have a study that we're getting ready to submit where we're looking, assessing whether that parasocial commitment actually does connect the 2 variables, celebrity worship and vulnerable narcissism, which indeed it does seem to be the case. Further study looking at depression, anxiety, and stress in the context of a psychometric question. Celebrity worship with social media influencers. Again, a new aspect of this where, at the time Lynn developed the scale, we thought of what celebrities I do, as movie stars, music stars, things like that. But now there's YouTubers and Instagram and all those things I don't know how to work. So all that stuff. The adverse childhood experiences and attachment, that there has been some connection to attachment difficulties in childhood. And so we're exploring that further. Celebrity worship, fandom, and loneliness. So there's a question in this whole domain. There's the kind of our camp of things that are looking at celebrity worship. And then there's another group that looks at what's probably a little more similar to the entertainment social aspect, fandom. And there's a little bit of disagreement on the extent to which that's a good or bad thing, the fandom. And again, it may be a matter of degree, how they're defining it, but we're looking at a measure we developed that's kind of singling out a fandom component to determine if that counts for unique variance in some of this.
He's being nice. A little bit of disagreement. They're pretty blunt.
Yeah.
That they don't like the psychometric approach to this. So they're very heavy case study individuals, and they're not shy about it. So
okay, well, yeah. So a little bit of disagreement there. I was being diplomatic. Okay, so celebrity worship and identity. So this is a new project we're getting ready to look further at measure of, identity consolidation, formation and so on like that, in people. Because even though that originally was the idea that sparked this from Dr. McCutcheon and colleagues, it hasn't really been, the identity aspect hasn't been looked at that much. We just started in with another one, perceived similarity, where we found that the more that one feels that they correctly or incorrectly, realistically or unrealistically, are like their celebrity in some way, the more that accounts that is predictive, actually, and a very strong predictor, which is interesting. So again, the celebrity worship, narcissism subtypes, criminological thinking, some actually, because there was a 2007 paper actually suggested there would be some connection between addiction, not surprisingly, celebrity worship, and potential criminality. There's the stalking issue and things of that nature as well. Some current students are have done some stuff with body image and drinking decisions, a new study that's in the works. Looking at some results now from celebrity worship and politics, which there's been some connection with that too. Lynn McCutcheon found some connections with that too. Added towards sort of the criminal legal thinking, conspiratorial ideation, human trafficking myths. So just a whole range of, I mean, this is just our lab. This is not the not the range of studies and things that people are looking at.
Yeah, and so I thought what we should do, we ended with this one just to kind of transition to the next next slide, because we thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about the belief in pseudoscience and things like that, because that's always fascinated me. Some of my earlier work within this was actually looking at celebrity worship and belief in things like Freudian ideology and accepting of some of the more outlandish parts of Freud. Not that everything that Freud did was out there, but some of the outlandish stuff. We did some work connecting celebrity worship to conspiracy theory belief, conspiratorial ideation. Some of the work we've got now, actually at one of that kind of middle level, seems to be linked in a couple of different cases, not only in belief in human trafficking myths, but also conspiracy theories, as well as belief in Freudian ideology. But we thought we'd talk to you a little bit about one of our papers that came out this year, which actually was about the belief in astrology, which was kind of a neat study that was based on some work that was done in 2022. And just to kind of give you a sense of what we did, Anderson in 2022 actually linked grandiose narcissism to a greater belief in astrology. And the argument was that both of those have the overlapping kind of focus on the self, right? A self worldview. So grandiose is a big focus on the self. Astrology is kind of, a worldview about what's going to happen to me today based on what's happening celestially, right? But the other part of this that we took the approach related to kind of the stress that's linked to celebrity worship, the stress that's linked to vulnerable narcissism, which was not accounted for in that original study. And so we thought the intersection of the stress that's linked to vulnerable narcissism, the stress that's linked to, normally when people seem to be stressed is when they start to look for answers and they actually become more likely to believe in pseudoscience and things like that and conspiracy theories. And so what we did, we actually looked at belief in astrology, celebrity worship, grandiose narcissism, and vulnerable narcissism all in the same model to try to see if celebrity worship and vulnerable narcissism actually were really what might be accounting for what's going on in belief in astrology. And so just to kind of give you, we don't need to go through all of this, but just the correlations, if we look at belief in astrology, that's the BAI. So that's our number one. We found that celebrity worship, and this is the vulnerable narcissism measure, and the grandiose narcissism measure, all positively correlated to belief in astrology, right? But when we actually ran our regression to control for these factors, what we ended up finding was that only the celebrity worship and the vulnerable narcissism remained as significant predictors of belief in astrology, and the grandiose narcissism fell out. And so again, this was just another one of those studies. This was one of 3 or 4 in the past year or so, where the vulnerable narcissism has really kind of taken the forefront. And really what we think is that, that's the narcissism subtype that's associated with a lot of the stress, but it's also associated with those identity problems, which may kind of lead to that absorption addiction relationship becoming stronger and stronger over time. But again, these are just, these are some of these early studies and trying to develop that model, but I think we're starting to move in that direction. So.
So given all these factors and negative associations with celebrity worship, the apparent rise of celebrity worship over the years, which interestingly, actually, I believe it's UGA, there's some researchers there that also finding that, or has some evidence that narcissism has been on the rise too, and connected to the same things, the technology, the more ability, the greater ability to, focus on self. And really kind of understand these things for a number of reasons, especially given, the younger people's greater access to, media all the time now, whereas opposed it was, three channels at one point, at least in my day. So issues such as this, but we have implications for mental health in general, the stress, anxiety associations, along with that. Social, again, going back to younger individuals and children, the social and developmental impact. It would be a good idea to notice if, a younger person, someone's kid, for example, was a little, heavily involved in celebrity at a young age. And again, given the access of celebrity info nowadays, the media and cultural relevance, back to the technology, which is been attributed to a lot of this, increase in not only the narcissism, but celebrity worship in general. Oh, okay.
So we thought we'd end with, we study celebrity worship. We're not immune to it. We follow celebrities too. I'm an Iron Maiden guy. He's a Motley Crue guy, and he met that one, and he's pretty sure he'd remember you.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm sure if I met him again, I remember you.
You're my biggest fan.
Yeah, biggest fan.
But yeah, so hopefully that was kind of a general overview of kind of what we do. We'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, questions about it. Thanks for coming.